When we think about a nation's power and influence in world affairs, we often look at military or economic might as primary measurements. But when it comes to addressing chronic problems and promoting social justice, it takes more than the clenched fist. The exercise of soft power comes into play. Often below the radar of headlines and breaking news, companies, foundations, universities, and other institutions of civil society are hard at work addressing a range of problems and challenges in ways that can create long-term and systemic change. This week on Dialogue, changing the world through the open hand. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests today are Joan Dassin and Rob Buchanan. Joan Dassin is Executive Director of the Ford Foundation International Fellowship Program. She's been involved since the beginning, coordinating the program's initial design process back in 1999 and becoming Executive Director when the organization was created in 2001. Prior to her current position, she served as the Ford Foundation's representative to Brazil and as Regional Director for Latin America. Rob Buchanan is president of the El Hibri Charitable Foundation, having previously served as Managing Director of International Programs for the Council on Foundations. He spent 10 years with Oxfam America, 5 of those as Program Director for the Horn of Africa. His resume also includes staff positions with the United States Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. Joan, Rob, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
If we could begin in setting the scene, helping our viewers and listeners sort out the playing field. When we talk about this world of whether we foundations, NGOs, maybe that's a good place to start. Is NGO the big umbrella term that includes all of this type of work?
Well, I would say the big umbrella is the nonprofit sector. And within the nonprofit sector, there are foundations, and for the purposes of the Council on Foundations, where I worked, we defined a foundation as a grant-making organization. So they're the grant makers, and then they're the grant recipients, which would be the nonprofit NGOs, all within that nonprofit umbrella. So they're all nonprofits. Some of them are providing resources, some of them are accepting resources and operating programs.
And give us a sense of the range of activity. How many of them are there out there? How many Ford Foundation-like entities are out there operating in the world?
Well, private foundations in the United States, many, including from very small family foundations all the way to the Gates Foundation, which is the largest in the United States, as well as Ford, which has the second largest endowment and amount of resources. So the number I heard was something like 10,000 private foundations. Is that right, Rob?
There are actually many more than that. There are upwards of 70,000 foundations in the United States registered with the government. Many of those are really not very active. I think there may be about 30,000 that are active grant-making foundations.
And the literature talks about operational versus advocacy as one way to look at the various activities. Your program would fall under the operational category. You're actually working with people to put them through a process. What about the El Hibri Foundation? Is that advocacy or operational?
Well, the El Hibri Foundation is a private family foundation with deep roots in the Middle East, in Lebanon in particular, but the family lives here in the United States and has worldwide business interests. So I wouldn't say it's either in the operational or the advocacy. It's a grant-making, it's a funding organization. So the work of the foundation is to fund a number of nonprofit organizations, some of which are here in the United States, some of which are in other countries, to support the work of the foundation, which is to promote the core values of Islam, peace and justice and charity and civic responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joan, when we frame this discussion, we talked about it in terms of soft power. Mm-hmm. When you're out there doing your work, do you ever think of it as exercising soft power?
Well, that has connotations of foreign policy.
It has some pejorative aspects to it.
First of all, perhaps I should clarify what it is that I do,
Sure.
Which is I run an organization called the International Fellowships Fund, which is technically a grant-seeking organization in the sense that we were provided with funds by the Ford Foundation, which is a grant-making organization, to fund postgraduate study for advanced degrees for people in developing countries around the world. So my organization helps fund scholarships for people to study anywhere in the world. And is that a form of soft power? In the sense that what we do directly contributes to social justice and development, we think of the opportunity to pursue advanced studies in development-related fields like education, health, environmental science, and so on, as very connected to the development processes around the world, not necessarily reflecting foreign policy goals of the United States or any other individual government, however.
Joan, I would add that I think that foundations don't focus on the power aspect of what they're doing, although they do partner occasionally with the federal government, with the State Department, with the World Bank, and organizations that are more in the political arena. I think foundations are more concerned about addressing underlying problems, global challenges, climate change and poverty and infectious diseases and those kinds of things. So they're trying to use private resources for public purposes, which is to try to address these issues and try to work with organizations around the world that are doing research or they're providing services or in some respect working on those problems. So it's not so much about the power as it is about finding solutions.
Yeah, it's particularly the type of work that both of you are doing. Power is a word that probably doesn't exactly do it justice. But on the other hand, we are talking about influence, promoting certain values. There's a value statement about education that is clear-cut and nothing, of course, that you would hide from.
You're right.
So in a sense, do you ever see your work as doing that, as building some sort of a global community based on shared values?
Yes, very much so. You know, our project, which is funded exclusively by the Ford Foundation, is a very large, multi-year, multi-million-dollar investment in the power of higher education.
The largest single investment by Ford on any particular program.
It's a total investment of some $350 million over 10 years. It's one of the largest single grants actually ever made by a private foundation. And I think it's very significant that for the Ford Foundation, which is an American foundation based in the United States, but nonetheless that has ties with organizations around the world, this is a program that is intended to create capacity to lead and generate solutions to these kinds of chronic problems and acute poverty problems around the world. That's why the Ford Foundation has made this kind of investment, because it as an organization which has been around for decades, it has always believed that investing in people is a way to create solutions to the problem that those people face.
Rob, you described a pretty wide range of types of activities earlier, and you mentioned your old employer, the Council on Foundations. How much of this work is coordinated? How much is there overlap among the various groups that are out there working?
Well, there's quite a bit of overlap, although foundations tend to develop a mission statement and a set of objectives and goals and that are approved normally by the board that focuses the work of the foundation in a particular area in order not to have the assets sort of allocated too broadly over too many issues and not able to make an impact. So each foundation will try to focus on a particular area, but even so there is overlap. And foundations more and more, I mean, one of the developments that I've seen within the last 10 years is the interest in foundations in doing more collaboration and partnerships with other foundations. I think they just came to the conclusion that if we're ever going to have impact on these huge international challenges like climate change and poverty and HIV/AIDS, we're not going to be able to do it alone. Our resources are just not sufficient to do that. But we may be able to have an impact if we partner with other foundations, if we partner with governments, if we partner with the business community. And so we've seen more and more rather sophisticated partnerships evolving in the last 10 or 15 years, I would say, and across sectors, and each sector brings a different set of tools to the issue and to the problem, and so there's a lot of energy in that area.
Joan, talk to us a bit about your whole decentralized approach, working with a lot of local partners to identify those students that you'll support.
Well, one of the main objectives, missions of our program, this massive investment in international higher education, is to create capacity to solve local problems by local people. And we believe that in order to acquire the knowledge that's necessary to make policies and be aware of the latest global trends and apprised of the technology that's available in all of these areas, people from the communities that are most affected by these kinds of chronic problems, whether they're environmental devastation or human rights abuses or lack of access to clean water or natural resources, the people that are most affected by those processes are the ones that have the strongest incentive to improve those conditions. So our fellowship is aimed at people who themselves are from marginalized communities, whatever that may mean in different countries. For example, I worked for many years in Latin America, and we know that while there are significant populations of indigenous people and Afro-descendant people throughout the Americas, they are very underrepresented in higher education. They have very little opportunities to advance to the university, much less to postgraduate work. And yet their communities, their indigenous communities, for example, in the highlands of Guatemala or elsewhere throughout the region, are very affected by all the problems that we have discussed. Poor communities are the most vulnerable communities. So we feel that by targeting educational opportunities to people who are living close to the problems, they will then have an incentive to use their knowledge to solve those problems. So that's why we work with partner organizations, about 24 of them around the world, to help implement our program. And what we actually do is re-grant some of the Ford Foundation funds that were granted to my organization to our local partners, so that they in turn can use their networks to reach deep into rural communities and other underserved areas to really spread the wealth. A typical student, for example, might be, just taking the Mexico example, an indigenous leader from Oaxaca, speaker of Spanish as a second language because Zapotec, or an indigenous language, is his or her first language, someone who may be interested in traditional agricultural technologies or local knowledge that can help people in those communities retain their traditions, their culture, but at the same time improve their living standards. So one of the advantages of our program is, because we work with local organizations, we can identify people of that sort who are from vulnerable, poor communities, but are leaders in those places and are strongly committed to improving those conditions.
When you find these people who receive the fellowships, and in a case like you described, they might come from very traditional cultures, rural areas, and then they find themselves at some major university in London or the United States. Or, do you do any preparation for them to avoid culture shock?
We do quite a lot, and we have developed over the 10 years of the program a very intensive set of what we call pre-academic or preparatory activities, which may include things like computer training. Many of these people may not be familiar with computers. Quantitative skills that may be necessary for advanced graduate work that they wouldn't have had exposure to, intercultural communication skills, English language if that's necessary. And we find that this helps to level the playing field, because it's not a lack of capacity. It's not that our kinds of students have failed in schools, but often schools have failed them in terms of being able to deliver a high-quality preparation for higher education. So we try to fill that gap, and we work with students in an intensive advising process for a year between the time they are selected and the time that they actually enroll. And the result of that investment up front is we have now over 4,000 fellows in the program, about 2,500 graduates, and who have studied in universities all around the world, in almost 45 countries, over 500 different universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, National University of Mexico, and so on, around the world, the best universities. We have a 98% completion rate, which makes the case very definitively that you can make higher education, in this case, more inclusive, But you can also encourage people and create an enabling environment so that they will succeed.
What about once those 98% graduate, how do you avoid the trap of a brain drain where some don't go back to their native land and share the wealth in the way that you'd like them to?
Well, this brain drain issue is a very serious question. It's not a new issue. There has been discussion of brain drain since the 1950s. But in particular, in recent years, in many countries, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, some of the smaller countries in the Caribbean and Central America are disproportionately affected because the most highly educated people leave these societies because there are very few opportunities for work. So we're highly aware of this problem, and we certainly did not want to inadvertently contribute to it. And in fact, you find many policymakers around the world who are wary of investing in higher education, even though they need trained people to run their countries,
sure.
Because they fear that they may lose them and therefore lose the benefit of that investment. So what we do is, rather than addressing the problem at the end of people's studies, worrying about will they or will they not go back, we address it at the beginning by our selection criteria. So we select people who are not only academically qualified to do high-level graduate work at the best universities in the world, but people who have a commitment to their communities, to using that knowledge. And it's possible to measure that and choose those for whom there is more evidence of a commitment in their trajectory prior to competing for the fellowship than others. And so at the end of the day, among these 2,500 graduates of ours from 22 countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, we have over an 80% return rate, and almost everyone else is still finishing their studies.
Rob, I want to ask you some similar questions about your work, with the understanding you've been on the job for about 2 months in the new position. But talk to us about the types of grants that you give and the type of work that you're encouraging. I know peace studies is part of this.
Peace education. We're working with American University on that, and some other colleges and universities as well, to try to introduce peace education as an academic program and as a program worthy of research. And so we're supporting that.
How common is a peace education curriculum?
There are a few universities that have it, but it's not all that common at this point. We'd like to see it in more places. We're also funding some charitable work with children's organizations in Lebanon. For instance, we're supporting an organization called Karama, which is the Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights organization, which is a very busy organization these days. They're working internationally. So this is a few examples of the kind of thing we're doing. But I might just mention that, I mean, the Ford International Scholarship Program is really a terrific example of the kind of area where I think grant-making foundations have a real advantage. You know, grant makers, and Ford has been one of the leaders in the international grant-making area. The foundations have great administrative flexibility. They can move pretty quickly when they want to respond to an issue, unlike government or even the business sector. They can be innovative. They can take risks, which government agencies often cannot do. Foundations can afford to fail. They think in the long-term perspective, and I think this is what resonated about the Ford Scholarship Program, thinking very, very long-term, 5, 10,
Not
15, 20, 25.
Cycle.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is where there's a great, I think, complement between the work that foundations can bring to the international development scene and agenda, and working with governments. Governments have far more resources than the foundations. Foundations, according to a study that the Council on Foundations did with the Foundation Center, the most recent year was 2007, U.S. foundations gave about $5.4 billion for international purposes, both to U.S.-based organizations and to organizations based in other countries. The U.S. government's foreign aid program is around $20 billion, and I think all official aid from all governments is around $100 billion. So you see, it's not that foundations have the most resources, but I think they have the flexibility, they have the innovation, population. They can tap into the best minds and the best thinking, often coming from the grassroots level. They can work with grassroots organizations much more easily than governments can. So I think this is where this sort of dynamism and energy around solving international problems comes from the foundation world, and they make a really substantial contribution, and it's growing all the time.
Yeah. Give us some insight into what some of the risks are working on the ground, and often the greatest need is in areas where there's instability, which leads to security risks. The work that you're doing when you talk about rights of Muslim women could put you in some very dicey situations. What do foundations and grant-giving organizations do when working in areas where there are physical threats to their workers?
Right. Well, most foundations, the Ford Foundation is an example because Ford has field offices around the world, but most foundations don't have staff based overseas. So we're funding organizations which then may have staff based overseas if they're a U.S. organization, or they may be an indigenous organization in some other country. Some of those countries are quite unstable. Some of those countries are, there's a physical warfare going on. I think foundations want to be very, very careful about funding in a conflict situation. They understand, as I think we all do, that the needs are often very great, but it's on a more sort of disaster level. It's hard to build long-term institutions in a conflict zone. You need a certain level of stability in order to do that. And because foundations are looking to the long term, I think they want to go into those difficult countries. They want to be supportive of organizations and people on the ground that want to lay the foundation for those long-term institutions, but they're not going to do it in the middle of a hot conflict. I mean, that would be a waste of resources to do that.
I have an example from our program that I think illustrates perfectly what Rob is suggesting, that, for example, we have one of our fellows is a Liberian who, we don't operate the program in Liberia, but he was living as a refugee in Ghana, and he was actually selected for a fellowship through our selection process in Ghana. He went to Penn State. He did very well. He received his master's degree in agriculture and sustainable development. And just as he was finishing, Mrs. Sirleaf was elected as president of Liberia, and there was, for the first time in years, an opportunity to go back to his home country and help rebuild. So he immediately went back to Liberia, where he started a whole new department at the University of Monrovia, began a new NGO, and was able to make a very substantive contribution. And I think that illustrates exactly the sort of role for a foundation in the sense of long-term preparation. We were there investing in this young person's education, and when it was possible for him to go into a post-conflict situation, he was right there ready to contribute.
Is there a way to generalize about governments as far as, are they generally supportive of your work within their boundaries, or do they create barriers?
It depends, obviously, on the situation, but actually that speaks to a point I was going to add to the previous observation, that while foundations, private foundations, have many advantages in their flexibility, the ability to be innovative, the ability to take the long view because there may be less pressure for short-term results. We all know that education, for example, or any kind of rights-based process takes years to develop and so on. At the same time, foundations, because they have smaller resources, miss an opportunity for impact if they cannot work with governments. And I think one of the more vexing, really challenging problems in our field is what to do with an innovation when it's been successful. How do you scale it up? How do you create sustainability? Because at the end of the day, what you do not want to do is create a kind of dependency on any donor, external donor, be they private or a multilateral organization. And I know that all of us who've worked overseas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the donor dependency syndrome is one that creates very complex conflicting feelings among the grantee community. It's a reality, it's a fact of life. They may not have their own resources. On the other hand, they can be extremely resentful of who is it that sets the priorities. So it's very important for private foundations, when working internationally, to look for locally based partners.
And another wrinkle on that issue is that not all governments are supportive of the social justice work that foundations are supporting, and so foundations sometimes find themselves in the position of supporting local organizations in countries around the world that actually have a quite hostile relationship with their own government, and the government is not comfortable with non-governmental organizations rising up within the civil society. They see them as a threat
to their power. Speaking of power.
Absolutely, and yet those organizations rely on the support they get from U.S. foundations to carry on their work. So it's tricky. It can be very tricky.
And in many situations, foreign donors have to register with appropriate ministries in the respective countries and have their grants reviewed. This happens in Arab countries, in Russia today. This is a very complicated process, and pressures can be brought to bear. There was a recent case where the British Council, a scholarship organization working for the British government, was harassed and forced to close in Russia. So there can be relatively high stakes even for seemingly neutral sorts of activities.
Quick final thought, and I hate to do this to you, about 20 seconds for each of you, but you know, as two people whose resumes include a long career, combined career of looking at the world and looking at problems and attempting to solve them, how do you feel when you look at the landscape now, optimistic or pessimistic? And, just general thoughts, 20 seconds each.
I'm always optimistic. I wouldn't be in the field of international development for most of my career.
Even with all the challenges?
Even with all the challenges. No, I think there's progress being made. We tend to focus on the areas that are failing, the failed states, the civil wars, the great humanitarian tragedies around the world, and there's still far too many of those. But there is real progress being made if you look at the basic indices of human development. And I think that civil society and the kinds of organizations that foundations are supporting around the world, I think this has been a real part of that picture.
Joan, a quick final thought.
It's congenital. People who work in our field are going to be optimistic.
Can't stop yourselves.
But what I think, from my perspective, and especially working over the last decade with so many bright young people around the world who are dedicated to the development of their home countries, is that there is so much talent out there. Of people who truly want to make a change and will make enormous sacrifices so that happens. That is what gives me great inspiration. We've had thousands and thousands of candidates of people who would like to do that. So I think there is much good out there to be harnessed.
Well, thanks to both of you for today and also for your ongoing good works around the globe. And to those of you watching on MHZ or listening on radio, we appreciate your comments and encourage you to share them with us. And you can do so by sending email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, on behalf of the Dialogue production team and all the staff at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.